But if you'll be turning to 1 Samuel chapter 17, the title of the lesson is Faith in the Face of Giants, and we're dealing with a lesson tonight that probably for 3,000 years since it actually happened, it has inspired men and women alike. It has been probably a story that has been told to boys and girls by their mothers as they are growing up. But if you think about that, for 3,000 years, and it has so seeped into our culture that even atheists who don't even believe in God will talk about David and Goliath. I was watching a documentary a while ago about the USA hockey team from the 1980 Winter Olympics. And it was a David versus Goliath matchup, as it was coined then, and how the United States hockey team beat the the supposedly unstoppable Russian hockey team in the semifinals. I guess just a few hours from here, come to think of it. But it's a story that's really resonated and inspired people for a long, long time. And so what do you have in this story? Well, in 1 Samuel chapter 17, you have the army of Israel, which are the good guys, and you have the army of Philistia, the Philistine army, which are the bad guys, if you will. And they're camped on opposite sides of the valley of Elah. And the Israelites have really had a time with the Philistines. The Philistines have oppressed them, and they've been fighting for a number of years, off and on. And so as they're camped, you have this, quite literally, a giant of a man who marches out of the Philistine camp and into the field of battle. And he stares at the Israelite army and he yells out, "Send me a man." And he does that for 40 days. And to give you an idea of the size of this man, he's over 9 feet tall. He wears armor that weighs over 100 or about 125 pounds. The head of his spear, just the head of it, weighs 15 pounds. If you've ever tried to throw something that weighs 15 pounds, good luck. You can really hurt your arm trying to do something like that. But if you consider that that's just the tip of the head of the spear, not including the shaft, this is a massive man with massive armament. And he's calling out the Israelite army. And what makes matters even, if you will, more daunting or seem more just unwinnable is that he's almost twice the size of the average Israelite man at the time, who would have been maybe around 5'6" or maybe even a little bit shorter. If you think about it, most of the Israelite men probably weighed as much as Goliath's armor weighed. And so they look down this valley and they see this man who makes fun of their God, makes fun of them, and issues a challenge to them day after day. You send your best fighter down here and he and I will fight. And if you guys win, or if your champion wins, we'll be your servants. But if I win, you have to be ours. And that seems a simple challenge. But day after day, he keeps saying, "Send me a man." In fact, if you look in verse 11, really the end of verse 10, it says, "I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man, that we may fight together." And when Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. See, nobody wants to take him up on his challenge. Not even the king of Israel wants to take him up on his challenge. And then into the story enters a boy, probably early teens. He's certainly not old enough to go and fight. He's a shepherd boy. He's taking care of his father's sheep. But his 3 oldest brothers are fighting. They're camped with the army of Israel. And so their father, Jesse, packs some provisions and says, "Take these to your 3 oldest brothers and see how things are going." So David leaves the flock and he goes to the camp of the Israelites, and he goes to the front line, and people start telling him about Goliath. and what Goliath has been doing for 40 days. And David can't hardly believe his ears. In fact, if you look in verse 26, it says, "Then David spoke to the men who were standing by him, saying, 'What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should taunt the armies of the living God?'" So you have this young teenager who's saying, who does this guy think he is to talk this way about God and about his army? Why hasn't somebody gone and shut him up already? David, as a young boy, can't believe what he's hearing. And then you look in the next verse, and his oldest brother Eliab, who's been there, doesn't appreciate what David's saying. And he says his anger, verse 28, burned against David, and he said, "Why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your insolence and the wickedness of your heart, for you have come down in order to see the battle." In other words, it's easy to talk big, David, when you haven't had to do any of the fighting. You just came down just to run your mouth and to just see the carnage. David said, "Wait a second. Didn't I just ask a question?" And David goes right back on doing what he was doing, telling people, "I cannot believe that nobody's gone and fought him. But I'll go and fight him." And so Saul hears about this, the king of Israel, and he brings David in, and David says, "Don't worry, don't be afraid." Verse 32, "Let no man's heart fail on account of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." And Saul says, "You can't do that. You're just a boy." And David says, "Well, wait a second. I've been shepherding my father's sheep for a while, and sometimes a bear or a lion will come and take one of those sheep, and I'll go and I'll take it back from them. And when the bear or the lion rise up to try and kill me, then I grab them by the beard and I kill them." Seems very matter of fact when you look at the text there. And he says, and this Philistine, this uncircumcised Philistine, will be just like one of them, because he has taunted the army of the living God. So Saul says, "All right, I'll let you go and fight." And he says, "But you need some armor and you need a sword." And so Saul puts his own armor on him, gives him his own sword, and David says, "I can't use these. It's too big, and I've not been trained to use this kind of stuff." And so David does, he takes that off and he picks up what he is trained to use, and that's a staff and a sling and 5 smooth stones. He knows how to use those things. And he knows how to basically just trust in God. And so he takes those and he enters the field of battle, and Goliath can't believe what he sees. He's insulted. He's the champion of the Philistine army. He looks at David and he sees a boy. He's insulted. "I can't believe they sent a boy out." And then he sees a stick in his hand, a staff. Not a sword. David's not wearing any armor. And Goliath says, "What am I, some kind of dog that you send a boy with a stick?" That's how dogs are treated. And so Goliath says to David, "I'm going to feed your body to the birds today." And Goliath starts moving toward David. Notice what David does. He runs toward Goliath, and he takes one of those smooth stones in that sling, and he lets it go, and it sinks into Goliath's forehead. Goliath falls down dead, and then David takes Goliath's own sword and cuts his head off. And when the army of Philistia sees that their champion has been killed by a boy, they don't live up to their end of the agreement. They don't say, "All right, we're your servants now." They actually run, they flee. And when the army of Israel sees this, they chase after them, and there's a great victory for Israel that day. Brethren, what can we learn from this story? You know, the title of the lesson is Faith in the Face of Giants. And while I don't think anybody in here has run into someone that's 9 feet tall and wears clothes that weigh 125 pounds, which is not quite as much as I weigh anymore, but that's as much as I weighed when I graduated from high school, I guess, but that's been 20-something years. But we don't have those literal Goliaths that we face anymore. We have Goliaths in life, so to speak, that we face. Tough battles that we are trying to conquer. And so, what do we do? What do we do to beat those Goliaths? Because fighting for a man even 6'2", which is what I am, or for a man even taller, imagine fighting somebody who's over 9 feet tall. There's no way you can win. And sometimes in life, we fight these battles that there's just no way we can win. So what do? Well, when we look at 1 Samuel 17, the first thing we see is that faith faces giants. Once again, there's this giant, Goliath, who for 40 days calls out a challenge to the army of Israel. He's over 9 feet tall. His armor weighs more or as much as they do. And nobody wants to answer the challenge. See, notice verse 11, or the end of verse 10. He says, I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. And what does King Saul and what does the Israelite army do? Nothing. When Saul and all Israel heard the words of the Philistine, or these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. They looked at Goliath and said, there's no way we can win. We're not going to fight. There's no way that we can win. And then look at David in verse 26. He's not the king. He's not even a warrior. He hasn't been trained to fight. He's just a boy, probably in his early teens once again. But verse 26, he says, what will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should taunt the armies of the living God? Once again, who does this guy think he is to talk that way about God and to talk that way about his people? And why hasn't somebody already gone out there after day one and done something about it? See, David's in his early teens, but he can't believe that the men that he's talking to haven't done something. And so when you look at the difference, you see a nation and a king that refused to fight him. The battle was lost without even fighting for them. But then you see a young boy who said, let's fight. I'll face him. You look again at verse 32. Let no man's heart fail on account of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. In other words, don't worry, I'll protect you. That's what this boy says to the king. When my daughter Bailey was about maybe 3 years old or so, we came home, drove up into the driveway, and the lights were on inside. And we had left during the day, and so we didn't remember leaving lights on or anything like that. And so we drove up and we're a little surprised. And Jenny said, what if somebody's in there robbing? I don't think so. But, let me, I guess, Jenny, you go in there first and I'll, I said, well, let me go in there and I'll see. And if there is somebody in there, if you hear something, call 911. And Bailey said, and she's about 3 years old maybe, she said, Dad, I'm coming with you. And I said, wait a second, Bailey, what are you going to do if there's a robber in there? Without batting an eye, she said, I'm going to kick him in the gut. That was her response. She wasn't scared. She wasn't scared at all. Now, if I would have said, okay, Bailey, that makes me feel a lot better. Why don't you go ahead and go in? Well, what kind of a coward and how shameful would that be? And yet that's what you have here. You have a king who should have been the leader of his people, should have had enough faith in God, and he didn't go out there. And yet a boy said, don't worry about it, King Saul. I'll protect you. And if Saul had any sense, he would have been ashamed. And he actually would have told David to sit down and he would have gone out himself. But you have a boy who knew that faith faces giants. Brethren, sometimes it's just hard to be a Christian. And there are times where it is hard to be a Christian. Maybe when you became a Christian because you had to change your life to bring it into line with what the Bible said. Maybe you lost some friends or some family when that happened because your priorities and their priorities are now different. That's hard. Maybe there's a sin that you just really struggle with, and it just seems at times that you just will not overcome that sin. It can be hard to be a Christian. Sometimes you look out at the world, and it just seems like as a Christian, we're on this small little island in just a world of hostility towards all things that are good and moral and right. Sometimes it's tempting to just not fight, right? There's a Goliath, if you will, right there that we may face, and sometimes it's just tempting to give up. After all, I miss my friends. After all, I'm tired of struggling with this sin. After all, I enjoyed my old life. After all, this fight is not winnable. You look in Numbers 13, beginning in verses 31 and through 33. Children of Israel had come out of Egyptian bondage. They've been in Egypt for 400 years, and they're finally coming out of Egypt. They're going to the land of Canaan, and they're going to take possession of the land that God had promised to give them, finally. And they cross the Red Sea and go to Mount Sinai, cross the wilderness. They get to the edge of the land of Canaan. They send in 12 spies. And those spies see the might of the land. They come back, and what is the report that they give? We can't do it. They don't even want to fight. They don't even enter the field of battle. They're just too afraid. But then you look at places like Hebrews chapter 10, verse 39. But we are not of those who shrink back to destruction, but of those who have faith to the preserving of the soul. You see, the writer of Hebrews is writing to Jewish Christians who, when they first became faithful, or when they first became Christians, were very zealous. But they've just really been discouraged because it's hard. It was hard for them to be a Christian. They were looking at the struggle, and they were looking at the fight, and they were starting to decide, you know what? We don't want to deal with it anymore, and they were going to go back into Judaism. And the writer of Hebrews says, that's not who we are. We don't shrink back to destruction. We are of those who have faith to the preserving of the soul. Sometimes as churches, we have to face a Goliath. Sometimes we look around and we say, it doesn't seem like people are interested around here. Or we just don't have enough people. Or we just don't have enough money. Or, well, we don't have a preacher. Or we don't have elders. Or we don't have this. We just can't get it done. It's just too hard. Why even try? And it's not just maybe places in New England or places in Colorado. You know what? There's a lot of little churches in Tennessee who look around, we're just too small. We're just too old. They just give up. And they don't even try. But you know what? David understood something. He understood that he wasn't really the one who was going to fight Goliath. Just like he understood that he wasn't the one really who was fighting the lion and the bear, but that God had been with him. Because there's no way a teenage boy should beat a lion or a bear. I would not recommend ever grabbing either one of those animals by the beard. It doesn't bode well for you. So something else had to be with him. And if he can do that with God's help, certainly he can kill this uncircumcised Philistine. Well, secondly, brethren, faith just doesn't face giants. Faith faces giants confidently. We don't enter the field of battle to face giants with our knees knocking, so to speak, but we do it with bold strides. When David first gets to the Israelite camp and he's made aware of what's been going on, as we've talked about, he's incredulous. He can't believe what's happening. And then notice what his brother does once again. He says, verse 28, "Why have you come down, and with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your insolence and the wickedness of your heart, for you have come down in order to see the battle." In other words, his brother says, stop talking like that. You know you can't beat him either. You're making fun of us and chastising us because we don't go out and fight him. You're just a teenager. You need to be quiet. You just came down here to see the battle and to see all the dead bodies and all the blood and all the gore and all that kind of stuff. And so, in other words, he was trying to tell his brother that he couldn't do it. And notice what David's response is. "What have I done now?" verse 29. Was it not just a question? And then notice what he does in verse 30. "Then he turned away from him to another and said the same thing, and the people answered the same thing as before." In other words, he says, I'm not going, even though you're my oldest brother, I'm not listening to you. And he turns back to another group of people and he says, "Why hasn't somebody gone out and shut this guy up? And if you guys won't do it, then I'll do it." You see, he didn't let his own brother discourage him from facing the giant because he knew that he could win. Brethren, going back to the book of Hebrews, in that same chapter 10, but this time verse 35, the writer of Hebrews says, "Therefore do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward." You know, brethren, sometimes it's easy to get discouraged in being a Christian. You know, it's hard. And sometimes we try to overcome things. Sometimes we try to deal with the problems that life throws at us. Sometimes as a congregation, we try to evangelize the community or to reach out and bring the lost to Christ. And it seems like oftentimes we always have somebody who it almost seems like they don't want us to succeed. We have that critic or whatever. Maybe it's the individual who, when we're struggling with the sin, instead of saying, "Hey, hang in there, you're going to get this, I know you're struggling," instead they say something like, "What's the matter with you? You know, how many times are you going to mess up like this?" Maybe you're trying to develop some talent, like teaching Bible class, or preaching, or song leading, or evangelizing, or something like that, and somebody says to you, "Yeah, I think you need to let somebody else handle that." Or maybe they come up to you and they just really lay into you because you said something that wasn't quite right. A couple years ago, and I've not been preaching as long as some in this room, but I've been preaching for a little while. But a couple of years ago, I got done with a sermon, and an older lady came up to me and said, "You know, that wasn't too bad. If you keep at it, you'll make a preacher one day." And she was being serious. Now, she meant it as a compliment, I think, but that wasn't exactly the most encouraging thing that I'd ever heard. You know, and sometimes we deal with those kinds of discouragement. You know, sometimes we try, and maybe it doesn't go as well as we think it will. I've been on campaigns where I was really hopeful. Maybe nobody was baptized. In fact, I went on a campaign, my very first campaign, with Wayne Berger. We went to the South Pacific, and we went to the Solomon Islands, and we did not baptize one person. And I was a little discouraged, and he told me, "You know, sometimes this happens, but in reflection, we did some good work because we strengthened the church." But you see, we have to face these Goliaths confidently. If you look at Psalm 27 and verse 3, which is a psalm that David wrote, it says, "Though a host encamp against me," that's an entire army. "Though an entire army encamp against me, my heart will not fear. Though war arise against me, in spite of this I shall be confident." You know, sometimes we look up and it just seems like we're making no progress. It just seems like we're not getting any better. It just seems like all the efforts that we have put forth into beating this Goliath or conquering our enemy, so to speak, have amounted to nothing. But we can't let discouragement get us. We have to keep fighting. Faith faces giants, and faith faces giants confidently. But brethren, faith also faces giants wisely. Looking back at 1 Samuel chapter 17, once again, after Eliab discourages, or at least tries to discourage David, Saul, the king, hears about what David has said, and so he summons David to him, and the first thing David says to Saul is, "Don't worry, don't be afraid, I'm going to go out and fight him." And Saul says, because Saul's looking at things foolishly from a physical perspective. He looks at David, who's, let's just say 13 or 14 possibly, and the fact that he's never been trained to be a warrior, and the fact that he's a little over half the size of Goliath and weighs about as much as his armor, and he says, there's just no way. There's no way that you're going to win this fight. And so David says, well, shepherded my father's sheep for a long time, and when a lion or a bear come and snatch one of them, I go and I take the sheep back, and then I grab the thing by the beard and I slay it. It's going to be the same with this Philistine, because he's taunted the Lord's army. So Saul says, okay, I'll let you do it. But then once again, he puts his armor on him. And he puts his sword in his hand, because in Saul's mind, he's thinking, if David's going to have any kind of a chance against Goliath, he's got to have all the usual tools of war. The problem is, Saul, being taller than anyone else in Israel, he's not Goliath tall, but he's still tall. His armor's too big for David, and David's not been trained to use it. So it'd just be a detriment to him. But you see, Saul was looking at things through worldly eyes. He thought the only way David will have a chance, and really he's got no chance, but the only way he'd even have a chance is if he wore this armor. But you see, David understood differently. David understood, when I fought the lion and the bear, I didn't have armor, and I didn't have a sword. I just had this staff, this sling, some rocks. And so he takes the same things, and he gets 5 smooth stones and puts them in his shepherd's bag. That's all he needs, because it was never David alone that fought. It was God that fought. And so faith faces giants wisely. It understands the tools that God has given us to be successful. And sometimes we look around and we think, what can we do against this ungodly world? What can we do against the Goliath I face? What can I do to be a better Christian? What can I do to overcome this sin? What can I do to spread the gospel to the community around me? What can I do? Well, the tools that God has given us, sometimes we look at that and we say, you know what? This world and our country is not going to be a better place until we get the right man in the White House. And this country's not going to be a better place until we get these laws enacted, or this political party in control. Or, if you've been following the news, our country's not going to be right unless this guy gets in the Supreme Court, or unless we keep this guy out of the Supreme Court. And so we try to pick up political tools to make this world better, or to face our Goliath, so to speak. Or, I've got to make enough money or do enough things to be happy in order to face my Goliath, so to speak. Or I've got to find the best medicine, or the best counselors, or the best whatever it might be to face my Goliath. And while in some, I'm not arguing against voting, I'm not arguing against medicine or other things like that. But what I am saying is we need to turn to the weapons God has given us first. You look in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. And Paul is talking there, beginning in about verse 18, about the foolishness or the wisdom of the world, and he's contrasting that with, as he's saying it tongue-in-cheekly, the foolishness of God. And what he's trying to say is the wisdom of the world can't accomplish what it's trying to accomplish. And so if you look at verse 21, he says, "For since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not come to know God, God was well pleased through the foolishness of the message preached to save those who believe." You know, sometimes, and I've been involved in a number of different churches, and we've talked church growth, if you will, in every single one. And I've heard over and over again, well, you can't grow unless you have this many people. And you can't grow unless you have this much money. And you can't grow if you don't live in this area, because people outside this area are just so unreceptive to the gospel. And the list goes on and on about what tools you need, so to speak, and what conditions you have to have in order to grow as a church. And yet the one thing Paul mentions here that we need to grow is available to every church. And that's simply the Word of God. And so if we want to overcome the Goliath of growth, or the Goliath of overcoming our own sin, or some other Goliath in our life, we need to turn to the Word first and foremost. But then there's also prayer. James 5 and verse 16 says, "Therefore, confess your sins to one another and pray for one another, that you may be healed. The effective, fervent prayer of a righteous man accomplishes much." And then you have the encouragement of your brothers and sisters in Christ. And that's one thing from you that I have experienced firsthand. 1 Thessalonians 5 and verse 11, "Therefore encourage one another and build up one another, just as you also are doing." So often, brethren, we look to other things first and foremost. Try and overcome our Goliaths. And in some respects, that's foolish on our part. It may be understandable, we all do it. But when we're faced with a challenge, we don't go to the tools that God has given us first. The Word, the prayer, and to our Christian brothers and sisters. So, faith faces giants. And faith faces giants confidently. And faith faces giants wisely. And faith, when it does all those things, then ends up facing giants triumphantly. You look at the end of 1 Samuel, chapter 17, and David leaves Saul's presence, and he steps onto the battlefield. And once again, I know we've discussed this before, but once again, Goliath looks and he's insulted. He's the champion of Philistia. They send a boy to fight him. It's not even worth his time. And then what's even worse is he doesn't come with armor and a sword. He comes with a stick. That's all Goliath sees. And Goliath is so insulted. He even says, "Am I some kind of dog that you send a boy with a stick after me?" That's how you handle a dog, not how you handle a 9+ foot man who's trained to be a warrior. That's not how you handle him. And so Goliath says to David, "I'm going to feed your body to the birds." And he starts advancing toward David. And notice once again what David does. David doesn't retreat. That would have been my first reaction, would to be back up. David doesn't even stand his ground. David doesn't even march toward Goliath. He runs toward Goliath. You have a boy. Now, if this were any other situation, we might say that boy is too stupid to be afraid. But that's not the situation here. That boy is too smart, too wise to be afraid. You see, all of Israel and King Saul didn't step on the battlefield because they already knew that they were going to lose. David stepped on the battlefield because he knew he was going to win. He didn't know how long the battle would last. He didn't know exactly how the battle was going to go, but he knew he was going to win. And so he picked up, or he took one of his stones, put it in his sling, and he let it go. And it sunk into Goliath's head and killed him. And David was the victor. And just to show everybody his victory, he used Goliath's own sword to cut off his head. And there was no doubt who the winner was. You know, there's never been another David and Goliath story quite like the actual one. Now, as USA hockey team winning the gold medal was exciting, but it wasn't quite on par with this. None of you are Denver Bronco fans, or maybe a couple of you are that are here. But I remember when they played the Green Bay Packers in the Super Bowl and how everybody in the country was saying how the Green Bay Packers were going to just mop the floor or the field. Cut the grass with them. I don't know what you say since it's on grass, but they were going to beat them. It wasn't even going to be a contest, and then they win. And I remember being in college, and my life was complete at that point because the Broncos had finally won the Super Bowl. But nothing compares to this because this never should have happened. A boy who had never been a fighter, at least trained to fight, with no armor, no weapons, defeats Goliath. Well, brethren, if you look in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 14, Paul says, "But thanks be to God who always leads us in triumph in Christ and manifests through us the sweet aroma of the knowledge of Him in every place." When soldiers would be victorious in battle and they would come back to their home city, there'd be sacrifices that were being offered. And the smell of the burning flesh of the animal that was being sacrificed signaled more than just dinner. That aroma smelled like victory. It smelled like victory, and it was a smell that for the returning victorious army was the best smell they had smelled in their life. And Paul uses that as an illustration here and says, God always leads us in triumph in Christ and manifests through us the sweet aroma of the knowledge of Him in every place. In other words, as we meditate on His Word, as we spread His Word, there's, if you will, a sweet aroma that goes out that smells like victory. See, when we stand on the battlefield and we face our Goliaths, we face that sin we've been struggling with, we face that discouragement we've been struggling with, we face the task of bringing others to Christ maybe that we've been struggling with for so many years and wrestling with for so many years. There's a sweet aroma that goes out that smells like victory. Now, it may not be how we planned it. It may not look like we thought it would, but it's victory. I look at this church here, and I'm not sure exactly when this congregation started. I think maybe the Blakes were here at the very beginning when they met in the house. But for 20 years, this church has been rock solid and has been a source of encouragement. You know, you would think from the outside looking in that this church would need the encouragement, and that's not to say that this church doesn't ever, but I'll be honest with you, you all have encouraged me more than I have ever encouraged you, I think. And that's a testament to you, because there's a sweet aroma of victory. There is this wonderful group of God's people that for 20 plus years have been beating back the armies of the devil and being a sweet aroma of victory to New England. And you're doing it one more time this weekend here with this lectureship. You know, brethren, how many churches never win the battle because they don't realize that God's on their side? They're going to win. Before the battle even starts, they're going to win. In Romans 8, in verse 37, Paul says, "But in all these things we overwhelmingly conquer through Him who loved us." In Ephesians 3, in verse 20, Paul says, "Now to him who is able to do far more abundantly beyond all that we ask or think, according to the power that works within us." You know, brethren, when we look down, so to speak, in the valley and we see that Goliath standing there, we don't know how we're going to beat him sometimes. We don't know what the battle's going to look like. We don't know how long the battle's going to last. We don't know if we'll come away with a few more scars than we wish we had. You know, sometimes we might even come away losing our physical lives. But you know what? Faith faces giants. And faith faces giants confidently, just like David. And faith faces giants wisely, just like David. And faith faces giants triumphantly. I don't know what better way to fight a battle than to know that no matter what, you're going to win. So, brethren, let us all remember that as we leave here. And really throughout the rest of our lives. This isn't just some children's story meant to inspire little boys and little girls. Put in the Bible to inspire all of us, and to help us to realize that no matter what we're facing, no matter what God has called us to do, no matter how daunting the task seems, we'll win if God's on our side. Thank you very much.